Hello and welcome to Make It Conscious. Today we're going to be continuing with this mini-series on Jung's Transcendent Function. So today is part 2, and I've titled this The Directedness of Mind. This is a term that Jung uses. He talks about the directedness of consciousness. So an alternative title for this one might be The Workings of Mind. And here we're really seeing the beginnings of Jung's own psychology, which he established and developed in the second half of his life. So we're just going to be recapping a little bit what we did in the last episode here very briefly. And I'll just start by saying that you remember this essay, The Transcendent Function, was originally written in 1916. It wasn't actually made public until 1958, 42 years later, when it was discovered by some students of his, and then it was reworked over by Jung. We don't know how much rework he did on it, but it sounds from his own comments like he didn't change it very much. He decided rather to see it as a historical document, as providing a snapshot of what he was thinking around that time in 1916, when he was 41 years old or thereabouts. So in terms of the context then, which we talked about in episode 1, he's going through the phase that he later coined his confrontation with the unconscious. So he's having a difficult time. It's very much in the depths of midlife. And this is really the foundation for a lot of what Jung was about going forward, not least his very process of individuation and what he then came to understand about the mind and the development of a human throughout one's lifetime. So this relatively short piece of writing, The Transcendent Function, is a little less than 10,000 words, and yet it encapsulates a lot of what Jung was about. So we talked a lot about that in the first episode, but today we're going to be looking more at what this means for the functions, the workings of mind, and the development of a human being. So this episode, as I said, is called The Directedness of Mind. In the next episode, we're going to be talking more about what this all means for you and what you can do about it. Okay. So just to recap, what is this, the transcendent function? What are we talking about? Well, you can think of it like this. The transcendent function refers to the psychological process that mediates between conscious and unconscious elements, allowing the psyche to evolve and reach a new state of integration or wholeness. It is called transcendent because it helps to transcend the opposition between conflicting elements of a psyche. So as much as there's always a spiritual implication when you're talking about psychology, but do not mistake this word transcendent for something intrinsically spiritual. It's not saying, transcending above something. It's talking about transcending the opposition between conflicting elements of the psyche. So I suppose it's more about the connotation, really, because that is what transcendence means in any context, I suppose, but it's not attempting to imply something mystical here. It's just saying that there's conflict in the mind between conflict and unconscious elements, and the transcendent function is the process by which they come to terms with each other. It is something we can do consciously in as far as we can create the conditions for this to happen. But at the same time, it's very much simply what the mind does. It's a natural feature of mind. It is simply a process which allows for this engagement between these two elements in order to find a way forward, a new state of integration, as he says here, or as I've written here. So we're going to be looking at some examples of this, of course, as we go through, but in short, this could really be anything. Anytime we experience any kind of tension in our mind, any kind of conflict, anytime we find ourselves saying one thing, doing another, intending one thing and saying another, or unable to execute on what we set out to do, this suggests some kind of conflict. Even though the conscious mind has its own perception and understanding of what's going on, there's the unconscious element too, which is vast and can take us in all kinds of directions. So whenever there's this disconnect between any of those things, what we want to do and what actually happens, where we end up, not least in the kinds of patterns we experience, familiar patterns that show up throughout our lives, it suggests there's some kind of conflict. So unless we just wish to presume that we're completely at the beck and call of the world we find ourselves in, Now, we cannot deny the influence of the world and the free will of other people in the world. I mean, we came from the world. So whatever we're projecting outwards has some relationship to experience that we've had in the past. Where it really originates is another question. But it doesn't all originate with you per se, because you originated somewhere else. So it's not about sort of trying to find the precise origin necessarily, but it's about taking responsibility for that going forward and understanding that our mind is bringing a lot of these things about because there is always an unconscious element to it. There has to be. We ended episode 1 on this quote here, which I'm showing for those watching on video. If you want to hear that again, go back to the last few minutes of episode 1. I'm not going to read the whole thing here. Just going to recap the core point, which is that the conscious and the unconscious seldom agree as to their contents and tendencies. And as Jung goes on here, this lack of parallelism is not just accidental or purposeless, but is due to the fact that the unconscious behaves in a compensatory or complementary manner towards the conscious. The reasons for this relationship are, which I've summarized on the next slide. So, first reason is threshold intensity. Only material with enough energy actually enters consciousness. So consciousness is this sort of specular process. And only that material which actually has enough energy, as it were, can enter consciousness. So energy, what's he talking about? Well, there's a whole other essay written by Jung where he actually talks about this. And he makes the point that actually energy in any context is a concept that we use to explain something we experience. And it follows certain rules. Actually, in the last episode as well, I talked about how psychic energy operates in much the same way as how we observe physical energy in the outer world. So it might be another episode in the future actually to talk about Jung's other writing on this. In fact, there's a quote I'm going to share in just a moment. But in principle, only that which has sufficient energy enters consciousness. So there's here one reason for this lack of parallelism between consciousness and what we're aware of and all the unconscious forces behind the scenes, which are vast, which include our personal unconscious, which include the collective unconscious, the will of the world, the will of history, the will of spirit. And that all has an influence, and it also contains the seeds of our development. Now, it's very tricky actually to talk about this stuff without veering over into metaphysics and philosophy more broadly. Jung wasn't really intending to do that. This is another interesting feature of Jung's work, is that he was a psychologist first and foremost. He wasn't pretending to be anything else. Although interestingly, in how he criticizes Georg Hegel for being a psychologist dressed up as a philosopher, in the most Jungian way, you could probably say the equivalent about Jung in some ways, in that he very much was a philosopher, behaving as a psychologist. Now, I don't think Jung would necessarily have even objected to that. The whole point of both of these men's work was about movement, moving forward, synthesis between opposites. This is a core feature to both of their philosophies. And in precisely that way, there is this tension here between philosophy and psychology and what they're both getting to. And I've often made the case that self-knowledge in all its forms and all that entails is where a lot of these lines cross. And now you say, well, what's that? Well, that's the whole point. It's not something you can capture in words. Self-knowledge is the pursuit, ultimately. Whatever we do, it all pertains to the self. So the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious mind is partly due to this fact that what turns up in consciousness contains an amount of energy that crosses this threshold, and it has to, because if we were just conscious of everything, there'd be no order, there'd be no movement, there'd just be this undifferentiated mass, and arguably no consciousness at all. And in fact, in our moments of, let's say, increased permeability with the unconscious mind, it can become a bit like that. I mean, dreams is one way of sort of understanding that effect and what that might be like. Secondly, inhibition / censorship. So because of its directed function, consciousness exercises an inhibition, which Freud calls censorship, on all incompatible material. So if it's not compatible with the conscious position, it simply doesn't become conscious, or it's not conscious at that time. So I've actually got an alternative word for this. I call it ignorance. That's a term that Alan Watts used many years ago. But it's like that. Not ignorance, but ignorance. And, maybe they're not that different, actually. Ignorance of what is incompatible with the conscious position. So we have to, in order to go anywhere, postulate a conscious view, and then we start to see the world in terms of our experience. This is how it has to be. There's no other way of doing it. It's the only way we can actually undergo this process of discovering the self. So as part of that, we have to draw a compromise between what we know and what there is. It's the whole reason we have an existence at all. So it's not a problem, it's not a mistake, it's how things have to be, but it contains both advantages and disadvantages, as Jung discusses, as we'll see in a moment. Also, present moment adaptation, so focusing on the immediate challenges of what's right in front of us versus the forgotten past, material which is in our personal unconscious, which has the potential to arise under certain conditions and lies there latent to be addressed at a later time. And of course, not overlooking the inherited features of the mind as well, the collective unconscious, the primordial images. So we can't have all of this just forcing itself upon us at any one moment. If that was to happen, that would be a form of psychosis, right? This is when essentially the alignment between the conscious and the unconscious is so thin, or the energy of the unconscious mind is reaching such a pivotal volume that it's forcing itself into the conscious mind. This is a psychotic break. And this is actually a very extreme form of something that stands to affect us every moment of every day. It's not that the unconscious mind is completely just cut off. I mean, that's an even bigger problem, because that's actually what the attempt to do that is what creates the potential for a true break to happen. And lastly, latent material, as I mentioned just now, arises under certain conditions. So there's always unconscious material there waiting to arise, whether that's shadow material, whether that's traits that are implicit, personality traits, cognitive functions, ways of learning about the world, ways of perceiving the world, but also ways of making decisions in the world. We tend to become, in early life, quite one-sided in all of those. Like maybe we value logic and thinking because that's simply what's worked for us until this point. Maybe we've recognized the illogical thinking of others, perhaps our family or people we encounter early in life. And so therefore we tend to double down perhaps on thinking as a way of getting things done. And it may be many years or even decades before we actually then come to reintegrate the value of feeling and realize that actually feeling is entirely rational, just like thinking. They're both actually considered rational functions in Jung's work. And actually truly adequate and competent thinking contains feeling. It accounts for feeling. And truly effective feeling accounts for thinking. And you can't actually have one without the other. You can become very, very conscious of one and very, very unconscious of the other. But that's not the same as having one without the other. This is precisely the point. This is precisely why there's compensation that goes on. So this is one example of kind of latent material, but it also applies to feeling, fear, and beliefs. And fear and emotion is a key one here, because arguably that's what a lot of the shadow material hangs off of. So it may be that we've had some traumatic experience in the past, and that creates an energetic potential that then needs to re-arise again under certain conditions. And even though we might be consciously trying to avoid such an experience, unconsciously we're actually bending back towards re-encountering it. This is a key apparent paradox in psychology and perhaps even a contradiction with mainstream science and particularly materialist science. Because the latter would typically say, well, if something's painful, we just avoid it, right? That's evolution, it's Darwinian evolution. But we see clearly in psychology that the opposite tends to happen. Actually, we tend to re-encounter painful things. How often do you come across an explanation for that? If it's painful, wouldn't we just merely try to avoid it? Problem solved. Well, actually, it's not even so much that we like to go around causing ourselves pain and getting into these patterns merely because it's familiar, so much as it reflects a pain that's already within us, only latent. So it has to come to the surface somehow as this energetic potential, in much the same way as if you chuck a ball up in the air, it has to come back down to earth. You have to chuck it pretty hard for that not to happen. And in much the same way, the mind is seeking a way to come back to balance. It's this compensatory feature. So Jung ends this section by saying, this readily explains the complementary attitude of the unconscious towards the conscious. So again, he's not making any metaphysical speculations here. He's not explaining why it is the way it is. That wasn't really his remit, not least when he was only 41 years old. He was developing a psychology, and this very essay, as he alludes to in his prefatory note, was really to help explain the mind for therapeutic purposes. So these are various features that he sees, but actually if you take these four, threshold intensity, the ignorance, the adaptation to the present moment, and the fact that there's latent material, there's actually quite a lot of overlap between these four. They're all sort of alluding to the same behavior of mind. All right, let's move on. So, jumping actually briefly to another essay called On Psychic Energy, which Jung wrote in 1948, which offers some more detail around this feature. So he says, the predominance of one or the other point of view depends less upon the objective behavior of things than upon the psychological attitude of the investigator and thinker. Empathy leads to the mechanistic view, abstraction to the energic view. Again, he's alluding to this feature of censorship, inhibition, or as I've termed it, ignorance. And the flip side of that, so the flip side to not seeing what is there, is superimposing what we hold to be true into ambiguity. So on one hand, we're seeing experience, seeing the world in terms of ourself, including our beliefs and our experience, and at the same time, not seeing what is actually there in its entirety. And we wouldn't be able to see what's actually there in its entirety, at least not all the time. So on one hand, there is censorship, ignorance, and on the other hand, there is a kind of projection. So empathy here, you might even liken to the cognitive function of feeling, to the mechanistic view. So causes have effects. Okay, this is happening because of this. This person's feeling this way because of something that's happened. And that's a necessary feature of mind. And at the same time, abstraction leading to maybe a more energic view or a teleological view. In other words, it's happening because it's moving towards a certain process. Now, either of those can seem not just true, but absolutely true in isolation. But neither of them are true in isolation. Together, they maybe form some transcendent truth. So Jung goes on here and says, they make the mistake of assuming that the subjective concept is identical with the behavior of the thing itself. So this is superimposing, projecting one's self, including one's beliefs and experiences, into what is being observed, explaining it in terms of what it already knows, literally seeing it in terms of itself. This is consciousness. This error is very common and leads to incessant conflicts with the opposing principle. So we see this not just within ourselves, but quite clearly between organizations with competing products or with competing perspectives on how things should be done, and more broadly, societally, between societies, between ideologies, between philosophies, between religions. This is all because of varying conscious perspectives, and each of them seeing things in terms of themselves and being very, very convinced of that. Now, it doesn't mean that if you're convinced of something that you haven't done some kind of synthesis to get there. every viewpoint is a product of previous syntheses. But if you're so convinced of something that you're not willing to ever change that view, whether it's a view of yourself, whether it's a view of your philosophy, whatever it might be, then that's likely to lead to problems. That's how you know that something's not being seen. But this isn't merely something we do actively. This is something that happens. Jung spoke about this in other places, that projection is something that happens. It's not merely a defense mechanism. We need to expand our understanding of projection. And because projection, for a start, isn't always a defense mechanism. It isn't always the assumption of something negative about ourselves that we're avoiding. It can be something positive, and it can also be just simply the way we render the world according to our experience. It's a form of empathy, in other words. So he goes on, but this intolerable contradiction only comes about through the illegitimate and thoughtless projection into the object of what is a mere point of view. So Jung was sounding a bit critical here, and just like what I just said, he seems to be labeling this contradiction as being thoughtless. But I think we have to not read into this too much in terms of its tone. I don't think Jung actually thought that anyone who has a viewpoint is just being thoughtless. But nonetheless, it is necessary to think things through in order to loosen that view a little bit. And actually later on, or rather in the Transcendent Function, he makes the point that it's not merely about thought. You cannot overcome this with mere thought and self-reflection, intellectual reflection. You have to actually encounter the opposite. And this is what gave birth to his practice of active imagination. He goes on, our points of view remain without contradiction only when they are restricted to the sphere of the psychological and are projected merely as hypotheses into the objective behavior of things. Right, so this is where these two lines meet. Whether we're talking about the mechanistic view in his case or the energic view, this applies to any other conflict we might encounter in life, is the understanding that, okay, I'm seeing things a certain way, but I am also projecting a mere hypothesis. It's possible to do that. You can see things a certain way and at the same time know that you're seeing it in terms of yourself. This doesn't remove the perception. This doesn't change the apparent objectivity of what you're seeing, but it does change your relationship to it. It does loosen the grip a little bit. It does make the interaction with the other or the opposition or the contradiction a little bit more smooth. It allows you to engage with the world in a more empathic way. And what comes first, the empathy or the understanding? Arguably they rise together, and both can be practiced as well and brought about through intention. Okay, so let's move on. So talking now about this directedness of mind, this feature of consciousness. And this is, of course, from the Transcendent Function essay, going back to that now. He said, the definiteness and directedness of the conscious mind are extremely important acquisitions, which humanity has bought at a very heavy sacrifice, and which in turn have rendered humanity the highest service. Without them, science, technology, and civilization would be impossible. Okay, so human civilization has existed in various forms for a long time. How long exactly is very much still up for debates. But in certain ways, these things, science, technology, have developed in quite a rapid way and at an increasing pace over many centuries. We often like to draw a line between, say, pre- and post-industrial revolution, or there's been other revolutions in the past, agricultural revolution, and these revolutions seem to be coming about thicker and faster. These are all brought about by the directedness of mind and of being able to focus and postulate an idea. They've brought about all these great things that we need, but they've also come at a great cost. So Jung goes on, we may say in general that social worthlessness increases to the degree that these qualities are impaired by the unconscious. So this is, again, becoming more and more of a thing in the modern age. I don't think it's going to stay that way. It can't stay this way. But the last few hundred years especially, say sort of post Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant sort of time, we've become so disconnected from the self, and the downfall of religion has been commensurate with that. And as a result of doubling down on materialism and science, we've developed a lot, we've learned a lot, but we've also lost a lot. And so there's this need now to reconcile these two sides, the conscious stance and the unconsciousness, and the truth that contains as well. So he goes on, great artists and others distinguished by creative gifts are, of course, exceptions to this rule. The very advantage that such individuals enjoy consists precisely in the permeability of the partition separating the conscious and the unconscious. But for those professions and social activities which require just this continuity and reliability, these exceptional human beings are, as a rule, of little value. Okay, that explains a few things. So the artist, the individual, the one who is seeking self-realization through their art, this is what art is. But try and place that person in the role of a policeman or something, and they're more likely to be a liability than any kind of advantage. So this is all part of self-knowledge as well. It's that understanding what relationship you do have with the unconscious mind in general. How permeable is that partition? And that's certainly not a fixed thing. There's no reason to think that's fixed. There may be certain inherited factors in that, and no doubt there are. But I believe that anyone can not only develop that relationship and that permeability, as Jung refers to it here, welcome in the unconscious content and work with it, but that everyone stands great benefit to doing so. As much as these features of our world today, science, technology, culture itself, could not have come about without this directedness of mind, there is no way that can happen without some kind of knock-on effect somewhere in the unconscious mind. But by virtue of imposing something into the world, and not merely perceiving the world that way, but actually it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where we start to then create the world in terms of that thing, thus reifying the very perception itself. So the lines between what is a mere perception of something objective and what is actually being manifested, created, constructed in the world, it's just a fine line. And those two ideas may not be that far apart in truth. So there's all manner of ways in which we can become very, very convinced by the truthfulness of our conscious position. But it is not and cannot be the absolute truth. It cannot be, because it's always in relation to something else. Unless you want to think of the universe as getting slightly metaphysical here, but as somehow not checking out in the end, of not being self-contained, but of being something that can exist in relation to nothing else. I mean, you're denying there some of the fundamental tenets of the universe as we understand it. Einstein's theory of relativity, thermodynamics. These things all imply this fact, that there is this interconnectivity, that everything exists in relation to everything else, that you can't do anything without some knock-on effect somewhere. Nothing exists in isolation. I mean, the moment you observe it, it's no longer isolated. So again, we're talking about Jung here. We don't want to get too metaphysical, but it's very hard not to when you're talking about such things, because as much as there may be very practical implications to this and little rules of thumb we can apply, personally, this is by no means the case for everyone, but I don't always find that wholly satisfying, because I will see the exceptions to that and where that breaks down. So I, for one, am always trying to get to the real reason to this, the explanation to this. This is one reason why I like idealist philosophy, because it talks about existence in this very self-contained way. It talks about how essentially existence can be explained from within its own bounds. It doesn't have to postulate something outside of it, which is just like an arbitrary thing, whatever that might be, as a way to explain what we experience. There's no God of the gaps in idealism. There's, by all means, mystery. Mystery is a very key and important part of it. But it doesn't postulate something, an arbitrary factor, as a way to explain what's within it. Okay. He goes on. So the quality of directedness makes for the inhibition or exclusion of all those psychic elements which appear to be or really are incompatible with it. Okay, this is another way of talking about this very same feature. So this is just typical of Jung. He likes to talk about similar effects in lots and lots of different ways. I find it useful to try and boil it down to a fundamental principle. And here this is this dichotomy, you might say, between directedness on one hand and ignorance on the other. So seeing the experience in terms of itself. So directedness is like the will. It goes towards something. It postulates something it wants to become or creates. It's a way of navigating the unknown. It's a way of surviving and thriving despite not knowing everything. And in doing so, it has to exclude that which appears to be incompatible with its thesis. And it will inevitably encounter other theses as an antithesis to its thesis. And we'll have to find a way through that, which is very Hegelian. But then he goes on, how do we know that the concurrent psychic material is incompatible? We know it by an act of judgment, which determines the direction of the path that is chosen and desired. This judgment is partial and prejudiced, since it chooses one particular possibility at the cost of all others. The judgment in its turn is always based on experience. That's key, i.e. on what is already known. As a rule, it is never based on what is new, what is still unknown, and what under certain conditions might considerably enrich the directed process. It is evident that it cannot be, for the very reason that the unconscious contents are excluded from consciousness. That's what makes them unconscious. So, a sort of simple example of this might be, say someone has learned very young that the way to navigate life is to be very, very kind, to be a people pleaser. Maybe their parents really drummed this into them at a very young age and punished them when they didn't. And that essentially was felt as a form of harm to the child. It was felt in the form of pain and negative emotion, which was then repressed, most likely. And this is in large part because there's a very deep projection going on between the child and their parent. The parents are embodying the mother and the father archetype. When the mother and the father archetype apparently seems to condemn you, you feel a disconnection from the self and you feel a great deal of harm. So through whatever mechanism this person maybe grows up, coming to believe and act as though kindness is the answer, not only a useful thing to be used in conjunction with other ways of being, but certainly early in life, likely to develop a belief that it is the way to proceed in life. I mean, how could it not be? Kindness is by definition a good thing, right? As it were. Here's the thing though. Reality is not like that. Reality is not merely a collection of isolated ideas of things. I mean, in some sense it is, and you can certainly see it that way if you like. And if you see it that way, for the reasons we discussed, it would appear that way. But there's another way of thinking about reality, and that is that there's also energies that are at play here. And so kindness is a kind of energy. And actually what we call kindness is just one form of that. Because if you take that to its extreme and you double down on that energy in a very one-sided way, well, eventually it comes to insist upon itself. And essentially, you will have fallen in love with the image of something, with the idea of something, at the expense, arguably, of the realness that it represents. So what might, in some cases, just be a very wholesome form of kindness can spill over into complete selflessness and a total lack of self-care that results. And in order to meet this energy of niceness, of kindness, end up actually doing things that arguably, at the very least, aren't very kind to oneself, or maybe even aren't kind to other people. This is when things become evil, because by doubling down on the mere appearance of kindness, one could become actually very defensive and very destructive towards others, and in violation of their freedom to uphold that image. Because when that image falls down, they must meet the energy of resistance. They must come face to face with an alternative view of themselves, another snapshot of reality, or the energy that says, maybe you're not so kind all the time. So where there's irony, there's insight. And the great irony here is that to be truly kind, not just merely appearing kind, but to be truly kind, we actually have to be willing to be seen as unkind. To be truly kind, we have to look after ourselves. How can you possibly be kind to someone else if you're not being kind to yourself? And in order to truly be kind to ourselves, we might actually have to risk looking unkind from time to time. So we're going to have to come face to face with the opposite and reach a synthesis somehow. This is the transcendent function. This is one way in which it can apply. So the function here being between what we would regard as real, if, oh, I'm a kind person, identifying as kind, having a kind persona, and the unreal, at least from the perspective of consciousness, of us being unkind. No, I'm not like that. I'm a kind person. Yeah, but see, the transcendent function has to mediate those two possibilities, those two realities. It's not that this person is unkind per se, but that the ego regards itself as kind and has shut out the incompatible view of unkindness. But there might be so much in that unconscious view, unconscious trait, and lots of stuff attached to that, that actually may well, as Jung says here, enrich the directed process. You may actually be more kind if you aren't afraid to be seen as unkind. But because the judgment is based on experience, there's no way this individual who identifies as kind can possibly know otherwise until they butt up against its opposite in reality. So until that point, they can be very much forgiven for basing their judgment on what is already known. It's the only way the mind can work. The question is, how permeable is that gap between conscious and unconscious? And how willing is that person to facilitate that interaction? Because the transcendent function is going to happen anyway. It's just, are we going to be willing to work with it? Are we taking responsibility for the mind? Are we practicing empathy? Are we cultivating wholesome intentions? Or are we just throwing caution to the wind and waiting for it to just force itself into our conscious experience and create some kind of blow up, some kind of consequence that might even be the end of us? So Jung goes on, through such acts of judgments, the directed process necessarily becomes one-sided. Even though the rational judgment may appear many-sided and unprejudiced, the very rationality of the judgment may even be the worst prejudice, since we call reasonable what appears reasonable to us. What appears unreasonable is therefore doomed to be excluded because of its irrational character. And this is key. It may really be irrational, but may equally well merely appear irrational without actually being so when seen from another standpoint. So what does it mean to be irrational if something doesn't make sense? Well, this is Hegel's view ultimately, is that the universe is rational. And the way I explain that is everything checks out in the end. The universe is self-contained. Your mind is self-contained. It all checks out with itself somewhere. But in this temporal, momentary way, it actually also has contradiction. It has plenty of contradiction. It has both contradiction and non-contradiction. And underneath all of that is the potential for unification, or at least harmony, not necessarily oneness, but wholeness, of bringing things back together and finding out what underpins all of it. And that is the self. That is the process of developing self-knowledge in all of its forms. It's all about this process. So Jung's point here is that what may actually appear irrational, now it may be irrational, it may be blatantly contradictory. We may be encountering someone in the world who is completely at war with themselves and is presenting themselves in a certain way to, the end of the road. They might be doing that with such fervor that everything in their world must subsume to the way they've come to view themselves. They're not willing to do the work. They're not willing to work through the trauma. And we're going to encounter people like that. But that doesn't mean that they're inherently rational. However, it doesn't mean necessarily that it doesn't make sense in the end. There's a reason that can occur. There's a reason we become contradictory. And so underneath it all checks out. But what appears irrational may merely appear irrational without actually being so. This is a common perception of say those who lead with a thinking preference in, say, the Myers-Briggs system and so on. Early in life, they might regard feeling as inherently irrational. But as I discussed earlier, there's actually nothing more rational than feeling. It's equally rational to thinking. And true thinking accounts for feeling. And true feeling accounts for thinking. It becomes, quote unquote, irrational when it insists on itself to the expense of all other things. So this is nothing other than a refusal to engage in this very process, in this process of the transcendent function. So this is why, look, there's another video to be made here. It's a whole other topic, but I think we actually need a more nuanced understanding of evil and what evil actually means. Because it's not merely about whether something is compensatory or contradictory to the conscious thesis. It's not merely that, oh, I don't like it because it goes against what I currently believe. That might be inconvenient, it might be very unpleasant, it might be traumatic, but that in itself doesn't make it evil. So what does make it evil might well be the very willful abuse of that freedom, the insistence on the alienated self at the expense of everything else. So the unwillingness to engage in any kind of transformation. So there's a whole other topic there, but it's relevant here because that would be irrational, arguably. That would be what doesn't make sense in the end. But at the same time, that also serves a purpose in the overall unfolding. And Jung wrote a lot about evil as well, which we should probably look at some point. So it's just to say that what appears irrational might not actually be. It might just be that it doesn't seem to fit with the conscious thesis. He goes on, one-sidedness is an unavoidable and necessary characteristic of the directed process. For direction implies one-sidedness. It is an advantage and a drawback at the same time. Even when no outwardly visible drawback seems to be present, there is always an equally pronounced counterposition in the unconscious. So I like this. Direction implies one-sidedness. One-sidedness, what's that? Well, nothing is truly one-sided at its essence. One-sided is a contradiction in terms. How can it be both one and on the side of something else? So implicit in the very term here is that there's something else not being seen. So direction implies that we become one-sided. So it's therefore both an advantage and a drawback at the same time. So what is that drawback? He goes on, the counterposition in the unconscious is not dangerous so long as it does not possess any high energy value. But if the tension increases as a result of too great one-sidedness, the counter tendency breaks through into consciousness, usually just at the moment when it is most important to maintain the conscious direction. Thus, the speaker makes a slip of the tongue just when he's particularly, that's an irony, just when he particularly wishes not to say anything stupid. This moment is critical because it possesses a high energy tension which, when the unconscious is already charged, may easily spark and release the unconscious content. So I've got this picture here of Reynard the Fox, who I believe is a character based in medieval folklore, and he's a trickster figure. He's a archetypal representation. And this is very much the trickster energy. It's like tripping you up just at that moment when you were trying to make things just a certain way, and trying to do things in the way they, as far as you're concerned, they had to be. And it can happen even when we're not that doggedly pursuing our conscious position. But it has this trickster energy because there's a kind of comedy in that, right? It's suddenly, oh, it's not what I thought. It's something else. I was going off on some idea, and it turned out to be not entirely wrong, because nothing is entirely wrong, but a bit misdirected away from some more essential transcendent truth. So as he says, the unconscious is not dangerous so long as it isn't repressed too much. But you see, that doesn't mean it isn't counteracting the conscious position. So he's talking here in very practical terms that you can sort of get by being very directed. But if you become too one-sided, then the unconscious reaches such a threshold that it has to actually then force itself into the conscious mind. Whether this is through your words, whether it's through your actions, whether it's through the very kinds of situations you end up finding yourself in life, in your vehement attempts to try and appear a certain way, to try and abide by your idea of yourself, whether it's someone who is more intelligent than others, whether it's someone who understands science more than anyone else, whether it's someone who is the kindest person on the planet. Now, if you want to be the kindest person on the planet, and everything you do is a way of bolstering and reinforcing that belief, it's inexorable that you'll come up against situations, attitudes, perceptions that call all of that into question, because that's fixed. And by being fixed, it may be a snapshot of truth, but it's not the absolute truth. This is why anything that's fixed must be called into question ultimately, because there's nothing that's fixed in our conditioned world. So he goes on, civilized life today demands concentrated, directed, conscious functioning. And this entails the risk of a considerable dissociation from the unconscious. The further we are able to remove ourselves from the unconscious through directed functioning, the more readily a powerful counterposition can build up in the unconscious. And when this breaks out, it may have disagreeable consequences. So in this image here, I've illustrated the concept of the shadow being the aspects of our personality that we find disagreeable or that are difficult to confront in ourselves. And even though Jung doesn't mention the shadow in the Transcendent Function, this is forming the preliminaries of his later theories on the shadow. So in being a certain way in the world, and that's fine, we have to do that, it's how we navigate, it's how we get by largely in the first half of life. It sets up an opposite, and this is the shadow. These are the parts we leave behind that contradict the way we see ourselves, or that just have been cast out. Because the shadow can be not just the opposite of how we like to show up, but it can also be the excess or the unwholesome form of how that we already know we show up. For example, the person who identifies as very, very kind, they may well repress unkindness, cruelty, selfishness, this kind of thing in their opposite position in the shadow. But they may also, not necessarily, but they may also resist the idea that they are maybe so kind that they're selfless and a pushover and that they just give everyone what they want all the time. And that's not me. I don't do that. Right? So there's two ways in which the shadow can turn up here, both as the excess of how we like to show up, but also as the opposite of how we like to show up. It's not the same thing. But if you take either to extreme, it becomes the same thing. It becomes self-serving, it becomes alienated, and it starts to insist upon itself. So whether that person is doubling down on their kindness to such an extent that they will persecute anyone who tells them or suggests otherwise, or whether they're doing the complete opposite and they're being completely selfish and just being out for themselves, are those two things really that different? In either case, they're essentially doubling down on themselves at the expense of transformation, of transcendence, of integration with the wider truth. So in this image here, I've tried to illustrate this, and this is very much how the shadow can work. If we're concentrated on how we see ourselves or what we're trying to achieve at work or whatever it is, and we're just not listening to the material that's coming from the unknown, from the unconscious, then it can build up to a point where it breaks out and things fall down. We have an explosion, like the tower car from the tower, things just go completely off the rails. Okay, he goes on, directedness is absolutely necessary for the conscious process, but as we have seen, it entails an unavoidable one-sidedness, since the psyche is a self-regulating system, just as the body is. The regulating counteraction will always develop in the unconscious. Were it not for the directedness of the conscious function, the counteracting influences of the unconscious could set in unhindered. It is just this directedness that excludes them. This, of course, does not inhibit the counteraction, which goes on in spite of everything. So, directing the mind does not stop whatever's going on in the unconscious mind. That will continue to develop a counter-reaction, whether we're conscious of it or not at this stage. And there's a distinction being drawn here between allowing it to build up to such an extent that it forces itself into our lives and into our minds, or whether we deliberately open up and engage with it through active imagination, through dream work, through just generally being willing to loosen our grip on our position, on our views, through intention, speech, and action. Right? It's percolating through every moment of every day. So he goes on, to this extent, the psyche of civilized man is no longer a self-regulating system, but could rather be compared to a machine whose speed regulation is so insensitive that it can continue to function to the point of self-injury, while on the other hand, it is subject to the arbitrary manipulations of a one-sided will. So civilized man, and my reading of this is not a civilized man, but modern man, not least from the Enlightenment era onwards and the Industrial Revolution. It's like our psyche is so directed to the point where you have this materialist science which basically forms the foundation of the mainstream belief systems that govern our world, whether it's through science, politics, technology. It's not entirely false, but it's not absolute truth either. And it is a product of this highly directed mind that has become enamored with itself because it's let go of the previous ways of engaging with itself, like religion and religious symbols. That can exist in some sense, and there's truth to that. But it's reached a point where there's so many incompatible religions that are incompatible with each other that they cannot exist peacefully simultaneously unless there's a willingness to engage in this process and to loosen the grip on that directedness, because they're just going to see everything they see in terms of themselves and the beliefs. And it will be presented to themselves as though it's an absolute truth. But so what's happened in letting go of that is it's kind of gone the other way, where the psyche of civilized man is just almost functioning to the point of self-injury. It's inviting this mother of negation in the form of unconscious material to force itself upon it. So on one hand, we have this one-sided will and the arbitrary manipulations that can arise from that. On the other, we have this unconscious mind that's waiting to just force itself into our experience at the most inconvenient or dangerous moment. This may well be showing up in all kinds of disasters in our modern world, whether it's the way we harm the planet, which in turn harms ourselves, whether it's through war and conflict. And the major one that's often not talked about enough in psychological circles, at least, is the dysfunctional monetary system and the obsession with this unit of currency, this idea of something, this symbol of contribution at the expense of the real thing. And many countries have, in modern times, already paid a very severe price for that, and developed Western countries are going the same way. So back to the text. He says, what really is the point of all this? And why is it so absolutely necessary to bring up the unconscious contents? Is it not sufficient if from time to time they come up of their own accord and make themselves unpleasantly felt? Does one have to drag the unconscious to the surface by force? On the contrary, should it not be the job of analysis to empty the unconscious of fantasies and in this way render it ineffective? Well, you can't empty the unconscious of fantasies. You cannot make the entire unconscious mind conscious, because by very virtue of being conscious and having directedness, it creates something in the unconscious. And also because it consists of so much more than what can be assimilated within a single ego. The whole objective psyche, the phylogenetic history of human experience. So he's asking rhetorical questions here. Can we not just let it spring itself upon us at any moment? Well, no, for the precise reasons we discussed, that in order to be truly kind, you have to be willing to be seen as unkind. In order to be truly effective, you have to be willing to be ineffective. You have to be willing to be criticized as ineffective. This is all about integrating the unconscious content and developing a relationship with it, understanding that it contains not just alternative perspectives, but also it contains what we need to truly realize our thesis. That's the point. This is not about coming back to zero. This is not about escaping reality. This is not about deleting ourself or our thesis. If anything, it's actually about becoming more whole and realized, creating something that didn't exist before. So, think of the hero's journey. He's not going out to just get lost and disappear. He's becoming something, but he's then also reintegrating with what's been left behind. It's not nihilistic. It's not about going back to zero and regarding reality as one great mistake. No, it's all about creating something. It's all about becoming something, but it's also about discovering something at the same time. He goes on, the secret participation of the unconscious is everywhere present without our having to search for it. But as it remains unconscious, we never really know what is going on or what to expect. What we are searching for is a way to make conscious those contents which are about to influence our actions, so that the secret interference of the unconscious and its unpleasant consequences can be avoided. So I suppose we can derive a couple of things from this. One is about the general attitude that we take to the unconscious mind. It is based in experience and understanding, because that very attitude is itself a kind of thesis that the conscious mind holds based on its experience. How could it not be? So it's understanding the role of the unconscious. The unconscious is by definition not conscious. However, the conscious mind can actually develop an understanding of it and a relationship with it. And that's very important that we do. So that's the first thing, this attitude and relationship to the unconscious. But the second is this implication of a proactive engagement with it. And in doing so, we can remove its secret interference, so we can avoid those blow-up moments that we risk by not doing so. But like I say, it's not only about avoiding danger so much as it is also about truly realizing ourselves. So he goes on, the reader will no doubt ask, why cannot the unconscious be left to its own devices? Those who have not already had a few bad experiences in this respect will naturally see no reason to control the unconscious. But anyone with sufficiently bad experience will eagerly welcome the bare possibility of doing so. Yeah, so once we've experienced a couple of interactions with our own unconscious mind and how that gets us in situations, it may well be quote unquote outer world situations with certain individuals, but it may also be that our own unconscious mind, patterns, beliefs, unconscious needs, these have led us to these situations and then also influence our own behavior in those situations. So this is very much about shadow work as well. And this is something that may well naturally happen around midlife, but it can happen a lot earlier. It can happen at any time, or it might not happen at all. We might resist it to such an extent that we just think, I've been listening to this guy talk for over an hour and I still have no idea what he's talking about. If so, then I commend your patience. But it's something that we eventually learn, and it's about breaking down our understanding of our preconceptions, not least this very directed understanding of the world itself in the form of materialism, how we've been brought up in that way. So there's what I would call a meta lesson underpinning all of this. It's not just about letting go of our directedness in specific areas, but understanding the very mechanisms and the very truth that sits behind that process. That there is no way of simply constructing a self or constructing a world without creating some kind of result by necessity somewhere else. Right. Moving on, Jung gives his own example. He says, an acquaintance of mine once told me a dream in which he stepped out into space from the top of a mountain. I explained to him something of the influence of the unconscious and warned him against dangerous mountaineering expeditions, for which he had a regular passion. But he laughed at such ideas. A few months later, while climbing a mountain, he actually did step off into space and was killed. So this is an example of how the unconscious mind can force itself into our experience and take the reins. And that if we don't listen to it, if we don't engage with it and open up to that alchemical transformation that has to occur, it's not that the unconscious has some kind of deliberate willful animosity towards us if we don't do that. It's simply a natural, unavoidable reaction of nature. You cannot have conscious without unconscious. They exist in relation to each other. And in just the same way, you cannot have directedness without some kind of compensatory force occurring in the unconscious mind. And so what happens if we insist on something at the expense of all others? Well, the remaining forces must take hold. This isn't some arbitrarily imposed force from the outside. This is the only way our minds and the only way reality can work. So then, last slide here. He says, anyone who has seen these things happen over and over again in every conceivable shade of dramatic intensity is bound to ponder. He becomes aware how easy it is to overlook the regulating influences, and that he should endeavor to pay attention to the unconscious regulation, which is so necessary for our mental and physical health. Accordingly, he will try to help himself by practicing self-observation and self-criticism. But mere self-observation and intellectual self-analysis are entirely inadequate as a means to establishing contact with the unconscious. Although no human being can be spared bad experiences, everyone shrinks from risking them, especially if he sees any way by which they might be circumvented. Knowledge of the regulating influences of the unconscious offers just such a possibility, and actually does render much bad experience unnecessary. What then are the means at our disposal of obtaining knowledge of the regulating factors? So we'll continue this in part 3. We'll be answering that very question. But let's just go over what he said here. You cannot merely think your way through this, because that's not truly engaging with the unconscious mind. It's clearly a part of it, but we have to actually engage with it in every possible way. And as I talked about in the first episode, this is an idea that really started with Kant, or at least was brought to light by Kant in his work, which greatly inspired Jung. And that's that you cannot come to knowledge just through thinking, or just through sensing, or just through intuition. There is a union that has to occur. And in much the same way, to truly know what it is the unconscious has to tell us, we cannot simply think about it. That would again just be another conscious directed process. We have to think about it, but we also have to experience it. We have to sense it and we have to intuit it. We have to feel it. And only that can lead to true knowledge. So with that said, I will thank you for your time and attention. Hope you found this useful and informative, and I will see you in the 3rd episode of the Transcendent Function.